prey sat among predators. But no one noticed, because she wore the clothes of a hunter. She didn't speak, didn't move sharply. She simply observed. She knew where the target was, knew when to strike, knew that one wrong move would blow 18 months of investigation into smoke. But then another beast appeared. Not an enemy, an ally badge on chest, gun at hip, and prejudice in his eyes. He didn't see a hunter, he only saw skin color. And in one stupid moment, he pulled the trigger, with a pair of handcuffs. She didn't scream, didn't resist, she just looked, and that look silenced the entire pack. So, who's the real predator here? Stay till the end, because the truth will shake you. Montgomery, 7:07 p.m. The warmth of the day still lingered on the gravel-paved road. Inside, Delacroix was the kind of upscale restaurant that needed no introduction. The sound of silverware brushing against fine porcelain rang out softly. Dim amber lights fell like sunset behind velvet drapes. Every seat was placed with deliberate care to blend into the scene, and in a quiet corner, just a few steps from the bar, Emily Carter sat alone on the outside, rippling silk dress, loose waves in her hair, makeup just elegant enough to pass for a startup founder awaiting investors. Only Emily knew the silver bracelet on her left wrist wasn't just jewelry. Embedded in that metal band was a high-tech recording device with a layered noise filter capable of picking up conversations within a 7-meter radius, even whispered ones. Emily, hold position. Marquez is incoming. He and 2 associates just entered from the west hallway. The voice in her earpiece was clipped and cold. Emily suddenly tilted her gaze past the edge of the straw-textured menu. Her eyes, sharp as blades on a face void of emotion, locked on Leonard Marquez, shaking hands with a man who looked like a businessman, but Emily knew from her mental map of the surveillance angles that it was Samuel Bricks, head of a network of shell companies out of Delaware. Tonight's menu had more than food on it. Marquez seemed casual, but Emily knew better. The way he shifted his weight on the chair, glanced over his shoulder before lifting his glass, even the smartwatch on his wrist. Despite knowing the FBI could trace Bluetooth devices, he was playing a part. Emily let her hand fall gently to her lap, activating the recorder. From now on, every sound, every word, every breath Marquez made would stream directly to HQ through an encrypted signal. She was ready. Everything was going according to plan, until a metal chair scraped loudly across the stone floor. Emily had only a second to lift her eyes before a tall figure stood at her table. "Ma'am, what brings you here tonight?" The voice was familiar, that kind of fake calm laced with the authority of someone used to giving orders. Emily's lips tightened. Thompson. His presence was the one thing Emily hadn't accounted for. His move made the criminal across from her pause, squint, then reach for his phone and walk out. Marquez had noticed, and now he was leaving. Emily clenched her fist beneath the table, forcing her face to stay composed. From that moment, the mission was cracking under pressure, and Thompson had officially become a liability. He walked in like the whole restaurant owed him a greeting. His police uniform was pressed to perfection, every crease sharp, his badge gleaming under the soft amber lights. Mark Thompson, a well-known patrol officer in Midtown, familiar with upscale bars, but never truly belonging to this world in any respectable sense. He wasn't here for dinner. Outside, dusk had just fallen, and the breeze from the Montgomery River stirred the deep red velvet curtains at the entrance. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of French wine, Italian perfume, and conversations both discreet and deliberately conspicuous. The regulars here weren't loud, but they knew how to make their presence felt. So when Thompson entered, the room dropped half a beat. Not because a keeper of the peace had arrived, but because of the threatening kind of power he carried with him. From the moment he crossed the etched glass door, his eyes began to scan, past the bar, past the Italian suits and evening gowns, and then stopped at a black woman sitting alone, Emily Carter. She didn't look up, still reading the menu, as if she had every reason to be there. But Thompson didn't need reasons to be suspicious. No report, no background check, just a look. He didn't see Emily. He saw a type, a black woman, alone, in a place of luxury, enough for him to judge. To Thompson, The scene didn't sit right. To him, a woman like her had no business being in a place like this unless something shady was going on. No companion, no food ordered, no interactions, too quiet to be harmless. And maybe what bothered him most wasn't her presence, it was how she carried herself, confident, calm, needing no permission to exist in this space. That, to Thompson, was a kind of provocation. No need for a file, no explanation, just the look. To him, the sight didn't fit. To him, a woman like her didn't belong in a place like this, unless she had something to hide. He approached the table like he was enforcing justice, though every move was an abuse of power disguised by authority. He nodded, halfway between polite and controlling. "Excuse me, ma'am," Thompson said, hand resting on his belt in a subconscious gesture of dominance. His tone carried a condescending edge, each word carefully chosen to underline the power he believed he held. "I need to know why you—" Emily looked up. Her eyes held no confusion, only the cold observation of someone far too familiar with moments like this. She spoke slowly, every word steady and chilled. "I'm having dinner." "Is there a problem, officer?" The response wasn't long or clever, but its simplicity annoyed Thompson. She wasn't afraid. She didn't flinch. She wasn't asking permission to be there. To him, that was offensive. He glanced quickly at the table. No food, just a glass of melting ice water, and a menu still on the first page. He smiled slightly. Not a friendly smile, but the kind that comes after he's already made up his mind. "You came to a fine dining restaurant just for water? Didn't order anything?" Emily held her expression. "I'm still deciding." Thompson squinted, then nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. He stepped back half a pace, straightened up, and shifted his tone. "Can I see some ID?" He didn't raise his voice, but the volume was enough for a few nearby diners to start paying attention. Emily could feel the glances from surrounding tables, hesitant, curious, tinged with quiet judgment. A black woman being asked for ID in a place where her skin tone was rarely seen. Emily knew exactly what this was. Not a question, but a warning shot. She slowly opened her wallet and pulled out a standard ID civilian, nothing to link her to the FBI. Her cover couldn't break now, not with Marquez watching. He took it, glanced at the name, then back at her face. Emily Carter. Unusual name. "What do you do?" "I'm a freelance financial analyst," she replied plainly. Part truth, part cover. "Where from?" "I work remotely." Thompson didn't speak for a few seconds. Then he tilted his head, lowered his voice, trying to corner her. "You know, I got a few complaints about someone who didn't look like a typical guest." Emily said nothing. Anger coiled tight in her chest. His words weren't new, just a different version of the same message. "You don't belong here, not because of what you did, but because of what you look like." Marquez was now watching them, his gaze alert. Emily could feel time slipping. One more delay, and the entire mission could fall apart. She pressed her lips together. "If I'm not causing trouble, not breaking any laws, then I have the right to sit here. Or are you planning to arrest me for taking too long to order?" The question froze Thompson for a second, but he didn't back off. He made a call. "Requesting backup. I've got a suspicious individual at Delacroix Restaurant." As he ended the call, Emily knew tonight's operation was over, but the bigger fight was just beginning. Emily leaned slightly, her hand resting gently on her thigh, an unconscious gesture on the surface. But in truth, it was a signal. She was activating the recording mode on her bracelet, the only device capable of capturing the exchange happening less than 5 meters away. Leonard Marquez, the money laundering kingpin the FBI had been tracking for nearly a year, was sitting on the other side of the bar. His eyes were hidden behind thick lashes, but his movements were unmistakable. He tilted his head to whisper something to the man beside him, a man in a lead-gray suit, a Swiss watch gleaming on his wrist. With practiced subtlety, Marquez pulled a brown envelope from his inner coat pocket and set it next to an untouched glass of whiskey. Emily didn't dare look away. From her table, the angle wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough. She couldn't blink. She couldn't flinch. Just a few seconds. That was all she needed to record the moment the envelope changed hands, and after that, an entire illegal financial network could be exposed. She took a deep breath, adjusted her wrist slightly to aim the microphone toward the source of the sound, a scattered noise, bouncing off the tiled floor and crystal glassware. The miniature recording system beneath the bracelet's shiny silver shell began to work. Keep the pace, no sudden moves, Emily told herself. She couldn't let emotion interfere. Marquez didn't know she was here, or more precisely, didn't know who she was. She was a shadow in his vision, and that was her greatest remaining advantage. Every second was a step closer to the evidence. Emily knew the FBI's response team was just a few blocks away, ready to act the moment she sent the signal. But everything had to be precise, not a single misstep. She began reading Marquez's lips, not catching everything, but enough to make out a few critical phrases. Intermediary bank, Cayman Transit, secured deposit package. Words only money launderers dared to speak aloud in a place like this. He was confident. Emily's lips curled, unsure if it was contempt or hope, until the sound of leather shoes scraping the wooden floor rose behind her. The footsteps stopped just behind her, like a gavel striking down on an unfinished chessboard. Emily didn't need to turn to know who had approached. A low, smug voice broke through, deliberately overpowering the sounds she was trying to capture. "I'm still not clear why you're here. Do you know anyone here?" Ark Thompson. The way he spoke wasn't a question. He was setting the stage, and Emily was the villain in the script he wrote for himself. She still didn't turn. Her eyes stayed locked on the bar, but she couldn't miss it. Marquez's reaction. He had seen. He looked over his companion's shoulder, his gaze drifting toward Emily, then to Thompson. For a brief moment, the smirk at the corner of his mouth froze, not disappeared, just hardened, like a thin layer of wax. He knew, maybe not exactly, but his survivor's instinct, sharpened by years of distrust, had sounded the alarm. Emily wanted to stand, to move in, to push the recorder closer, but she couldn't. She couldn't break character, couldn't give Thompson more reason to suspect her. She had to sit still, watching everything slip through her fingers, second by second. Marquez didn't panic. He folded the envelope, slowly slid it back into his coat. The man beside him leaned in, pretending to flag down a waiter, and Marquez, like a seasoned chess player, stood up. Every movement was perfect, natural, not a hint of tension. He adjusted his cuff, turned his back, and walked away as if he were simply switching seats. But Emily knew that was the retreat order. She caught sight of the phone he left on the table. An excuse, a signal, maybe a jamming device, maybe a message. Whatever it was, he had made a decision. The game was over, at least for tonight. And Emily? She still had to sit there, tied down by a pointless interrogation, though really not pointless at all, because for Thompson, someone like her being here was all the excuse he needed to ruin everything. The way he tilted his head, the way his hand lightly gripped his leather bag strap, the way he set his phone down like a casual prop, all of it said one thing. He was on alert. She had lost her chance. Emily watched Marquez's back as he turned into the corridor leading to the emergency exit and VIP parking. It was a blind spot. No cameras, no waitstaff, no FBI eyes. A perfect shadow zone. And now, it was also the slamming door on her 3-week effort. Thompson was still there, standing like he'd just fulfilled some noble mission. But Emily no longer heard him. She didn't hear the background noise, the clinking cutlery, the murmurs of diners whispering about what just happened at the corner table. Everything seemed muffled now, all drowned out by the steady thump in her chest. She didn't leave. She wouldn't let herself react emotionally. If she stood now, if she rushed after Marquez, she'd expose herself. And it wouldn't just be a failed operation, it could mean blowing her cover, compromising the entire network, and possibly risking her own life and her team's. Thompson said something, but Emily didn't register it. Her eyes were fixed on the phone Marquez had left, motionless, silent, but that silence unsettled her. A jamming device? A signal to someone? Or just a trap? Finally, she turned to Thompson, gave a slight nod as if conceding, but really just to keep him still to avoid further interference. She carefully moved her wrist, turning off the recorder on her bracelet. There was nothing left to capture. Everything had slipped out of reach. "Thank you, officer. I think I'll be leaving now," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. Thompson raised an eyebrow, seemingly surprised at her sudden cooperation. He stepped back half a pace, giving her room to stand. Emily left the table like a dinner date had simply ended on a sour note. And truthfully, that wasn't far from the truth. As she passed him, their eyes met for a second, not pleading, not angry, just a silent warning. He had done something he didn't understand. Outside, the night air was cold. Emily pulled her coat tighter, walked away from the restaurant without looking back. She didn't know where Marquez was, but she knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let this go, and neither would she. The game had begun, and next time she wouldn't let anyone get in her way. Thompson still stood in the center of the restaurant, feet slightly apart, like he was keeping order for the whole block. He held the phone to his ear, his voice dropping into a professional baritone. "Requesting backup at Delacroix. We have a person of interest who needs to be brought in for questioning, possibly tied to suspicious financial activity." Each word he spoke came out crisp and controlled, the cadence of someone used to managing situations. But to Emily, that last phrase, suspicious financial activity, was a lit match dropped into a powder keg. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they would trigger. She knew exactly what happened once a report like that was officially logged. The label alone could dismantle the secret identity she had spent nearly a year maintaining. One tap of the send button on his phone and everything could collapse in an instant. Emily froze. She didn't look at him, didn't speak. She simply stopped, as though an invisible wall had risen in the middle of her mission. Her heartbeat slowed, but her mind raced, calculating reactions, phrasing, body language. Every move had to be deliberate. A single misstep and months of work would be ruined. Thompson lowered his phone and turned to her. The look in his eyes wasn't doubt, it was conviction. He believed he'd uncovered something big, and he was ready to bask in the spotlight of exposing a suspect. There was no hesitation in him, no room for questions like, "What if I'm wrong?" The waiter passed by, their gaze brushing Emily's for a fleeting second, just a few moments. But in that glance was a quiet tension hard to define. Maybe they sensed something was off. Maybe they didn't dare say anything. But Emily felt something even clearer. She was no longer an FBI agent, no longer leading the investigation. She was just a name, yanked from her place. Shame crept in, not from fear, not from being caught, but from knowing there was nothing she could do to stop it. Not if she wanted to protect something bigger. She took a slow breath. She didn't look at Thompson, didn't look at the diners who were beginning to take notice. She kept her eyes on the door, the one Marquez had disappeared through just minutes earlier. She could still hear the echo of his heels on the floor, like a countdown to a plan slipping away. Emily tightened her hand under the table and stayed silent. It was the only move she had left to protect what remained of this fight. That phrase, suspicious financial activity, had struck like a blow, unraveling all the careful work she'd done to maintain her cover. She couldn't react, couldn't resist. She had to let him go through with it, knowing full well this could destroy the entire operation. Another restaurant staffer passed, their eyes catching Emily's again. In that moment, she no longer felt like an FBI agent, not a woman pursuing justice, just a name being called, in a place that never felt made for people like her. The restaurant doors swung open once more. Two uniformed officers stepped in, bulletproof vests still creased, their eyes scanning tables like they were hunting an escapee. Emily heard the steady thump of their boots on hardwood, like a death knell. Thompson signaled silently. No shout, no explanation. He was ready to end the scene he had written for himself. "Stand up, ma'am. We need you to come with us to clarify a few concerns," Thompson said, his tone flat as a field report. Emily didn't move. "What am I being suspected of?" she asked. eyes locked on Thompson. Uncooperative behavior, failure to verify your reason for being here, and possible involvement in suspicious transactions, he said, not blinking. Suspicious? Emily raised an eyebrow. Sitting in a restaurant, reading the menu. Haven't ordered, haven't left my seat. That's suspicious activity? Thompson paused, just briefly, then smirked. They say silence is a form of preparation. I've got good instincts for these things, and I don't believe in coincidence. And what exactly are those instincts based on? My skin color? The fact that I'm not with a white man? Or maybe just because I don't look like I belong here? Emily's tone stayed calm, but her voice had hardened. The two officers hesitated. Their eyes flicked between Thompson and Emily. She wasn't being hostile, wasn't angry. She was simply asking, and her questions were too valid to ignore. You're deflecting, Thompson said. We're following procedure. Emily nodded slightly. Then I will too. I won't resist, I won't obstruct, and I ask that this entire procedure be documented. She stood slowly, one hand pressing to the table as if to steady herself. No one touched her, but the invisible pressure of 3 armed men was enough to squeeze the air from her lungs. One of the officers pulled out the handcuffs, the metal glinting under the overhead lights. Emily extended her arms fluidly, like she'd rehearsed this moment her whole life. The cuffs were cold, her wrists tightened with a familiar sting. Thompson stepped closer, voice low. You could have avoided this if you'd cooperated from the start. Emily turned to him, unblinking. No, you didn't want cooperation. You wanted submission. You wanted me to ask permission to sit here, and because I didn't, you saw me as a threat. Thompson adjusted his belt, said nothing. One of the other officers turned away, lips pressed into a line. Emily was escorted out of the restaurant in a silence so dense it felt physical. No applause, no protest, just watching. Like a scene they'd all witnessed before and still chose not to interrupt. She didn't resist, didn't bow her head, didn't cry, because if anyone had to lower their head, it wasn't going to be her. Emily walked between the officers like a shadow pushed out of her own story. No shouts, no laughter, but the silence spoke louder than anything. A restaurant that had buzzed with clinking glasses and silverware was now dead quiet, the air squeezed tight by the presence of 3 armed men and 1 woman in cuffs. Camera clicks. Emily didn't need to look to know. Someone had pulled out her phone, maybe to gossip, maybe for clicks, or maybe to capture the very footage that could burn down an operation months in the making. She didn't know, and couldn't control it now. She glanced around one last time, the eyes curious, pitiful, detached. No one asked why. No one stood to demand what was happening. Everyone stayed in their role as a spectator, in a show they thought they couldn't interrupt. A woman at a nearby table gripped her boyfriend's hand. A waiter bowed his head and backed into the kitchen. Quiet reactions. Subtle, but not enough to change the fact Emily was being walked out like a criminal. As she passed the bar, Emily looked to her left. The brown envelope was gone, the evidence gone, and if she wasn't careful, her identity would vanish too. She lowered her head, not in shame, but to remember every look, every movement, every sound. Everything that happened tonight would become data, evidence, fire. One day, when the truth came out, she'd tell this story. Not to claim victory, but so those who stood silent would have to ask themselves, why didn't I speak up? And in the deepest part of tonight's helplessness, Emily knew she'd return. And next time, she'd be the one asking the questions. They might think she lost, but really, this was just a treat to set up the biggest strike. The patrol car rolled away from Delacroix, smooth to the point of eerie. Emily sat in the back seat, hands cuffed behind her, back resting against the cold bench. The thick, polished windows reflected a face that stayed calm, but wasn't quiet. Her mind was a whirlpool. Questions she hadn't had time to ask. Data she hadn't encrypted. Plans that had just been wrecked. Street lights sliced across the interior like blades of light cutting through the dark. Emily watched them flash past without blinking. Behind that unflinching gaze was a buried rage, not the kind that flares, but the kind that roots deep with a name. Its name was Thompson. Its name was the system. Its name was lazy judgment dressed in law. Up front, the two officers spoke in low voices, occasionally laughing. Thompson said nothing. He stared ahead, one hand on his knee, the other tapping the car door. The kind of rhythm that comes from someone convinced they did the right thing. But Emily knew. What he thought was right was a hit against the truth. She tilted her head, tried to stretch her wrists, but the cuffs held. The metal scraped her skin, cold and hard. It reminded her she wasn't being held by an enemy, but by the very system she had sworn to protect. She stayed silent, not because she was mute, but because it was a choice. Every word now was a double-edged knife. Emily had to protect her identity, had to hold on to the one thing she still controlled, her silence. Because she knew better than most, silence isn't weakness. It's strategy. She wasn't sitting there waiting to be rescued. She was stepping back to gauge the depth of the abyss the whole system was teetering over. And when the time came, she'd be the one to rewrite the rules. You know, Thompson's voice cut through her thoughts from the front seat. I could tell what kind of person you were the moment you walked in. Emily didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the flickering patterns of light and shadow sliding across the window. Her silence was a wall. Pretending to browse the menu, sitting in the blind spot, not ordering anything. That's how traffickers usually act. I've seen it before. Thompson glanced into the rearview mirror with a hint of smugness. You didn't think you'd get noticed, did you? Emily remained quiet, didn't blink. Her resolve wasn't defiance. It was the awareness that any reaction now could be twisted into evidence. Thompson chuckled, dry. You know why I noticed you? Not because you're a black woman, at least not just because of that. It was the way you looked around. You weren't there to enjoy anything, you were measuring the room. Emily turned her head slowly, locking eyes with his reflection in the mirror. Her voice was low, steady. Or maybe because I sat there, unafraid, because I didn't need permission to exist in that space. And that threatened you. The air in the car paused. Thompson turned back to the road, said nothing. One hand tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles pale. Emily knew she'd hit the nerve he didn't want touched, the truth. He hadn't cuffed her because of evidence. He cuffed her because of a feeling, the feeling that she didn't belong. Because her confidence challenged the power he thought he alone held. The car turned onto an empty road, streetlight beams cracking across the ceiling like fractured gold. Emily closed her eyes for a second, not from fatigue, to imprint everything that had just happened. This wasn't a personal error. It was a symptom of a system conditioned to act on control, not reason. She opened her eyes. In the darkness, her gaze sharpened like a silent promise. The game's not over, and she was already planning her next move. Faded streetlight flickered across the windshield in dull, patchy strokes like filthy water. Emily no longer watched the outside. She stared straight at the seat in front of her, at its perfect stitching, letting her mind drift elsewhere. She remembered her first undercover assignment, a similar case, a businessman with 3 shell companies and a money trail spanning multiple states. Back then, she was just a rookie, but she was told one thing. Sometimes, what breaks an operation isn't in the files. It's in the person who walks in with a badge and a bias. Bias, the thing that hadn't just interfered today. It had kicked in the door, pointed a finger at her, and drove off like justice was something it could hijack. Thompson sat silently in front. Maybe he was trying to justify things in his head. Maybe he didn't see himself as wrong. That was the real danger. Emily flexed her fingers. The cuffs scraped her wrist, but she didn't feel pain. Her anger wasn't fire. It was molten lava, quiet, simmering under her calm, waiting for a crack. She didn't need to scream, didn't need to cry. She wasn't a victim. She was a witness, a survivor. And next time, the one who ends it. The car turned into the local precinct. Ahead stood the familiar gray brick facade, a place many had entered whole, but didn't leave the same. Emily drew a deep breath. Her rage pulled tight, shrank into a sharp, focused point, cold as steel. She knew one thing. Whatever waited behind that door, the game was still on, and the one who started this fight wouldn't be the one to end it. The holding cell was a block of cold concrete, sealed tight as if time itself was suspended between the four walls. Emily sat at the edge of the iron bed, not leaning against the wall, not sighing, her eyes fixed on the metal door in front of her. She had no idea how long she had been sitting there. In this room, there was no clock, no windows. No one came to question or speak to her, just a white ceiling light, bright enough to deny fatigue, dim enough to suppress hope. No one entered. No one called her name. Everything was eerily quiet, as if the system was waiting for her to collapse from within. But Emily didn't break. She sat as a point of absolute stillness in a world slowly unraveling. No one at the station knew who she was. Not a single officer asked for federal identification. They followed habit. A black woman in handcuffs must be a problem. She wasn't surprised, but disappointment, slower and deeper than anger, had seeped into her bones. She didn't need an explanation. She just needed the right person to walk in, and deep down, Emily knew that moment was close. The cell door swung open without warning. Emily didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, eyes fixed on the figure walking in. Not a local officer, not a shift guard. The man wore a sharp gray suit, a gleaming Breitling on his wrist. Not someone who belonged in a place like this, and certainly not here by accident. "Miss Carter," he said, firm, clear, and to Emily, that voice was as familiar as breathing. "Agent Williams?" He didn't look at her right away. He walked straight to the surveillance camera in the corner, lifted his badge. A blink, the red light turned green. Access granted. A single, precise motion, no wasted effort. Emily stood slowly, saying nothing. She felt the air shift, the smell of disinfectant now mixed with something sharper, the scent of a system realizing it had made a grave mistake. At that moment, rushed footsteps echoed from the hallway. The second door opened. 4 officers entered first, followed by a man in a white shirt and stiff-collared uniform jacket. Captain Edwards, the local station commander. Edwards froze when he saw Williams. His face tightened for a moment, then quickly shifted to a polite tension. "What's going on here?" he asked, voice rough. Williams turned his head, responding with a single, clear line. "I'm taking my agent out here." Emily glanced at Edwards. His eyes didn't show anger, just confusion, mixed with the dawning realization that someone had pulled the curtain from in front of his eyes. He didn't yet understand what was happening, that the woman in handcuffs wasn't a criminal, but someone far above his pay grade. "Agent?" Edwards repeated, disbelieving. Williams nodded. He pulled a slim folder from his briefcase and placed it on the metal table. "Agent Emily Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation, assigned to Montgomery for a covert operation targeting a federal money laundering network. What happened tonight constitutes a serious obstruction of a high-level operation." A young officer behind Edwards swallowed hard. Thompson, now visible in the doorway, froze. The hallway thickened, like someone had drained all the oxygen from the building. Emily said nothing. She didn't need to. Williams' presence was enough. Every word he spoke hit the system Edwards commanded like a slap to the face. "He was arrested while on duty?" Edwards asked, more quietly this time. Williams didn't answer right away. He pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons. A video appeared. Emily, at Delacroix, in handcuffs, calmly staring at Thompson. The moment a TikToker had caught on camera. "The video's gone viral, but worse," Williams said, eyes glancing at Emily. "We lost a key suspect tonight due to one officer's failure to verify." He didn't say the name, but every eye turned to Thompson. Emily stepped forward, standing beside Williams. Still silent, still no need to justify anything. Her silence had become the loudest statement. Not everyone who's arrested is guilty, and not everyone in uniform represents justice. Williams took his time. He opened the folder before Edwards, turning each page slowly, as if he wanted everyone in the room to read it with their eyes, process it with their minds, and feel it in their gut just how big a mistake they'd made. The first page, Emily's badge, her photo, assignment number, endorsement from the FBI director, fresh federal verification stamps. The eyes on her now weren't suspicious. They were confused, ashamed, and in some cases, afraid. "This is a federal undercover operation," Williams said, his gaze sharp as a blade sweeping across the room. "The target is Leonard Marquez, head of a multi-state laundering network. Agent Carter was deployed to Montgomery by direct order of the Special Financial Crimes Division." Edwards braced himself against the table, his eyes now heavy, like waking from a long, unknowing dream. "Why weren't we informed?" Williams didn't blame, but he didn't concede either. Because it was classified, and because not everyone in the system deserves to know. The room froze. Thompson stood like nailed to the floor, his face a mix of shock and humiliation, not because he'd been exposed, but because he never saw himself as the villain in a story that might hit the front page by morning. "You filed a report claiming she looked suspicious?" Williams turned to Thompson, calling him out for the first time. Thompson stammered. "She was sitting alone, looking around a lot, didn't order. I had a hunch." Williams cut him off cold. "You arrested a federal agent over a hunch?" Edwards turned away, rubbing his temples. A young officer in the back discreetly pulled out his phone, then stuffed it away like it was radioactive. Emily didn't move. No badge flash. No outrage, no declarations. Her posture said it all. "I know exactly who I am," and that silence hit harder than any courtroom verdict. Williams closed the folder, but before tucking it away, he pulled out a supplemental brief. List of Outer Circle support agents, a freeze order on public files, and standby operations in 3 neighboring states, all marked top secret. "What happened tonight didn't just lose us a suspect," he said slowly. "It compromised 3 hot zones where the entire operation is now on hold." Edwards nodded. He understood, and he knew the cost of this mistake would not end with an apology. Emily stepped forward. Her voice was low but clear, the first words she'd spoken in hours. "No one in this room needs to feel sorry for me, but you should ask yourselves how many others have been treated like I was without Agent Williams showing up." No one answered, but the question had already been recorded, not on paper but in the minds of every witness present. She turned to Williams and gave a slight nod. He returned it, his eyes full of respect, not because she was an agent, but because she held her ground when dignity was denied. As they walked out, Edwards muttered one sentence, heavy as a sentence itself. "We arrested the wrong person, and I'll be answering for it the rest of my career." The video was less than a minute long, but it was enough to spark a social media earthquake. The footage, shaky and slightly off-angle, showed Emily being handcuffed inside the Delacroix restaurant. It was filmed on a phone, with the muffled whispers of the person recording mixing with Thompson's sharp command, "You need to come with us now." The moment Emily turned around, her eyes locking directly onto the camera, unflinching, unapologetic, became the defining image of defiance in the face of prejudice. Less than 2 hours later, the video was posted to TikTok with the caption, "Police arrest a black woman at a 5-star restaurant for dining alone." Within 3 hours, it hit 1 million views. By the end of the day, it had surpassed 12 million, spreading across Instagram Reels, Twitter, Facebook, and major news sites. The comments exploded in every direction. "Is she really FBI? Can't believe the police acted like that in public. This woman is incredible. The way she stayed calm while being cuffed. Total respect." But criticism came too. Why didn't she just say from the start she was an agent, sitting alone, not ordering? Who wouldn't be suspicious? Something's off. Hiding her identity? Why was she there alone? Public opinion split into 2 stark camps. One saw Emily as a symbol of strength in the face of injustice. The other viewed her as suspicious, another example of blurred lines in a system already low on trust. TikTokers started recreating the entire scene from multiple perspectives, clipping the moment Emily was escorted out, reconstructing the event timeline, and digging for live streams from nearby tables. A popular TikToker used AI to analyze Thompson's facial expressions in the video, concluding he looked not confused, but smug. Investigative journalists jumped in too. One Guardian article used the phrase, "The deliberate silence of a female agent humiliates the entire law enforcement system." CNN reported, FBI confirms Emily Carter as undercover agent, victim of unwarranted interference by local police. The hashtag Justice for Emily hit #1 nationwide on Twitter for 14 hours straight. Thousands began sharing personal stories of being treated unfairly because of appearance, race, or gender. Tweets like, "I was called suspicious just for wearing a hoodie in a cafe," or "got cited just for being an Asian woman in a high-end store," flooded the feed. But a counter-movement also emerged. Transparency Matters, arguing that everyone should comply if they don't want to be misunderstood. One post read, "If she had just said, 'I'm FBI,' this could have all been avoided." That, in turn, ignited a new debate. Why does someone have to reveal their identity just to be treated decently? This was no longer just Emily's story. It had become a national conversation about judgment, power, and silence. Emily Carter, the woman who said nothing in the video, had become the reason millions were now speaking out. Monday morning, an emergency meeting was called at the Montgomery Police Department. On the digital board behind the podium, the words, "Emergency Session on Professional Conduct," scrolled slowly. Officers entered the room quietly. No jokes, no greetings. The air was thick, like dust hanging in the aftermath of a media explosion. In the middle of the room was an empty chair. The same chair Mark Thompson had occupied countless times before, speaking with confidence, defending his decisions under the banner of proper procedure. But today, the empty chair spoke louder than any words. His suspension had been approved after only a preliminary internal review. Edwards, once Thompson's superior and ally, was the first to speak. His voice wasn't angry or disappointed, but unusually heavy. "We're not here to put one man on trial," he said, eyes down on his notes. "But we must question the system that led to these very real failures in judgment." No one objected. Even the head of internal affairs, a white woman named Melissa Hawthorne, known for being strict but fair, only said, "We can't call this an isolated incident when it keeps happening." A few younger officers lowered their heads. One rubbed his face. No one looked directly at the empty chair, but everyone knew if it wasn't Thompson today, it could be any one of them tomorrow. Thompson's last message to the department was brief. "I need time to reassess everything. No apology. No explanation." But to Edwards that was enough. "He has to face this himself," he said, "and we have to start fixing what's broken." The meeting ended in silence. But as the officers left the room, something had shifted. No more denial, just the beginning of a realization. Sometimes the biggest mistake isn't doing wrong, but believing you can't. That afternoon, Thompson went home earlier than usual. His small third-floor apartment greeted him with a strange kind of quiet. No sirens, no radio, no case files waiting. Just a stack of documents he had brought from the archives. Files he once thought were closed, finished, forgettable. He sat on the floor, surrounded by yellowed paper, forms he had signed without a second thought. Traffic stops, administrative checks, citations for suspicious behavior, they all bore his name, and they all had something in common. Most of the names weren't white. He used to tell himself it was random, the matter of odds, something that would happen to any cop over enough time. But now, through a harsher lens, the lens of undeniable truth, Thompson couldn't ignore the feeling. He had grown used to choosing suspicious individuals by instinct, and he had never once asked where that instinct came from. He reread a report from 2020. A 15-year-old boy stopped for riding a bike without a taillight in broad daylight. The boy was Mexican, didn't resist, didn't evade, yet the report read, "Uncooperative, tense demeanor." Thompson remembered the boy said just 2 sentences, but because he wouldn't meet his eyes, Thompson assumed he was hiding something. In the next move, call his parents, bring him to the station. That night, nothing happened, but now Thompson knew. A file had been created. A stain had been added to that boy's record. Thompson clenched his fist, not out of anger at anyone else, but for the first time, at himself. In the past, whenever someone brought up systemic bias, he would jump to respond, "I'm just following protocol." But those same protocols, when not paired with reflection, had become tools that legitimized prejudice. Now, alone in the middle of old files, Thompson saw clearly justice isn't just about laws being enforced, it's about questioning how we're enforcing them. Rain started falling around midnight. It tapped against the old window like a somber soundtrack to his spiraling thoughts. He sat alone on the couch, phone screen dimly lighting his unshaven face. He replayed the footage of Emily's arrest for maybe the 15th time, but this time with no sound, no voices, no commands, just the image, the way she stood up slowly, without resistance, the way she held her head high as the cuffs clicked shut, and her eyes that didn't look away from the lens. Thompson watched, and for the first time saw what he had missed. Not defiance, but strength. Not confrontation, but endurance. And beneath her silence, a question that had never been asked. How many people have I done this to without even realizing? His phone buzzed. A message from Internal Affairs. We need you to review and explain all questionable arrests made between 2019 and 2022, starting next week. Thompson stared at the message for a long time. No reaction, no excuse, no defense. Maybe for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking of justifying. He was thinking of truth. Outside, the rain kept falling. Thompson stood up, walked to his desk, and picked up a new file. This time not to sign it, but to read every word, every name, every situation, with one question in mind. If I weren't the officer that day, if I were the one stopped, would I have seen justice? Maybe not. And maybe that's exactly where he had to start. Not to forgive himself, but to make sure he never did it again. The order to temporarily remove Emily Carter from duty came during the Monday morning briefing at the regional FBI headquarters. The file wasn't thick, but the bold print at the top made it clear. Recommendation for suspension pending media impact assessment. To most, it was a necessary step while the video continued to circulate and controversy refused to die down. But to Emily, it felt like a slap. She respected the work Klein had done, the regional liaison agent who'd tried to contain the fallout when the Delacroix incident exploded. But she also knew he didn't have the power to stop what was coming. Emily, you need to leave Montgomery for a while. Head to headquarters, turn in the case files, suspend contact with informants, and submit all tech for audit. Emily nodded, her voice low but steady. I haven't finished the mission. Klein sighed, like a man speaking to someone standing in fire. We're talking about logic, not pride. You're the only operative whose cover's been blown. Because no one else would dare stand in a room full of people who think they don't belong. Because no one else looks like the easy suspect. I got arrested, but I survived, and someone like me needs to be seen. She knew Klein was listening, but he didn't have the authority to change the decision. The look he gave her wasn't anger or reproach, just a silent, unsettled question. Why keep fighting to be misunderstood, to be scrutinized? Emily didn't answer. She turned, walked out of the conference room. At the door, she paused once, said only one thing. We can't let others write the ending to a war we're still fighting. Outside in the corridor, the light seemed dimmer, but Emily's steps grew firmer. She no longer carried a badge or wielded official power, only conviction that a black woman standing tall in a room built to doubt her is more threatening than any faceless authority. And if her presence was now making waves, it was only because too many people had stayed silent for too long. The fight wasn't over, and Emily was still here. While Emily was temporarily removed from the operation, an internal audit report from the Inspector Division began to reveal unusual details. Lieutenant Ronald Harris, a senior officer who had led several high-profile crackdowns in Midtown, had questionable ties to financial activities connected to Leonard Marquez's real estate empire. What stood out most, Harris was the one who spoke with Mark Thompson just hours before the Delacroix incident. In a recording from the department's internal radio, extracted during the post-incident investigation, Harris's voice came through clearly. There's a strange woman at Delacroix. Doesn't look like she's here for dinner. Could be a reporter or something messy. If you're still in Midtown, check it out. Be careful, don't make a scene. Thompson had replied, understood. At the time, The instructions sounded harmless, but in hindsight, it was the spark, because shortly after that exchange, Thompson showed up at the scene, and Emily's entire operation collapsed. The investigation shifted to tracing Harris's communications and meeting logs. That's when they uncovered Harris had once attended an investment event at a resort in Belize, the same location where Marquez had registered a shell company. A subpoena for Harris was issued that night, but when agents arrived at his residence, Harris had vanished. His phone was off, his personal computer wiped clean. The neighborhood surveillance cameras had been disabled since the previous afternoon. Emily received the update while reviewing case files at the field office. She wasn't surprised. Harris's interference had been the final loose thread she hadn't yet grasped during her months undercover. "He's the one pulling strings," she murmured, "and he knows he's running out of time." The media soon picked up the story, referring to Harris as the vanished lieutenant. But to Emily, this wasn't a disappearance. It was a calculated escape, the retreat of a pawn who had convinced himself he controlled the board. And now that board was beginning to turn. Ever since Lieutenant Ronald Harris had been taken into federal custody, something in the air had shifted, not just inside the bureau, but around Emily herself. It wasn't paranoia. It was precision. The same instinct that had saved her life on 3 continents now whispered warnings between each breath. She began to notice small irregularities. A silver-gray sedan parked 1 block too close to her apartment. Not once, but twice. The unmistakable crunch of graveled footsteps behind her when she left the safe house late one night. A flicker of movement in a mirror window across from her building, long after midnight. Emily wasn't afraid. Fear was something she'd been trained to master. But she was aware. Every trained agent knows the difference between surveillance and coincidence. And this was methodical. This was tactical. She told no one at first. Not even Williams or Thompson, because if someone was watching her, then someone had something to lose, something that Harris's arrest had set in motion. It wasn't just about retaliation. It was about containment. And Emily Carter, to the wrong people, had become a leak too dangerous to tolerate. That night, the city was slick with mist. A gentle drizzle fell over downtown, pooling in the cracks between concrete and cobblestone. Emily had stayed late at the temporary command post, helping the legal team cross-recture a list of recently discovered shell companies tied to Marquez and the Harris files. It was nearly midnight when she finally left, fatigue burning behind her eyes. She tightened the belt of her trench coat and cut through a side alley she'd used a dozen times before. Narrow, damp, but faster than circling the full city block. Halfway through, she felt it. The light above her flickered once, then died, leaving only the ghost glow of a distant street lamp down the alley's far end. She stopped. There was no wind, no echo. Then, faint at first, then unmistakable, footsteps, not just behind, in front, both ends. 3 men emerged from the darkness. Their movements were controlled, not rushed, as if this had been rehearsed. One flicked open a collapsible baton. Another adjusted black gloves already pulled tight. The third, stockier, stood at the mouth of the alley, phone in hand but not filming, waiting for something or someone. Emily didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate, because real threats don't announce themselves, and real agents don't beg for answers in alleys. Her right hand moved without conscious thought, sliding to the inside pocket of her coat, where the handle of a compact folding knife lay nestled between layers of reinforced fabric. The first man lunged, a direct, obvious move, which meant distraction. Emily sidestepped, her boot slipping slightly on the wet ground, but she compensated with a turn and drove her elbow hard into his side. The sound was sickening. Ribs meeting pressure, he dropped the baton. The second attacker charged, arms wide, likely expecting her to retreat. Instead, she closed the gap. A quick sweep, a sharp, upward jab to the throat, and he folded like paper. The third man raised his phone, no longer waiting, but now observing. Emily locked eyes with him, and flung the knife. Not to kill, but close enough to send a message. It struck the wall beside him with a metallic thud. That was enough. He turned and bolted, the phone slipping from his grasp and skidding across the wet pavement. Emily didn't pursue. She knelt beside the groaning man she'd floored and cuffed him with a pair of compact restraints she kept on her belt. Then, calmly, she retrieved her phone and triggered the silent emergency signal, the one that bypassed local law enforcement and pinged directly to the FBI's Tactical Response Hub. When her team arrived minutes later, led by Agent Williams and 2 field specialists, they found her standing in the center of the alley like a sentinel. Her coat was damp, hair tangled and darkened by rain, but her presence was unshaken. Emily pointed without words to the man in cuffs, now silent and sullen. She didn't need to explain the rest. Williams looked around. At the discarded baton, the phone still blinking in the shadows, the faint smear of blood near the drain. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Not even close," she replied. "But this changes things." Her voice was steady, but something behind her eyes had hardened. "They're not just cleaning up," she continued. "They're escalating. Harris talked, and someone out there wants to erase everything he touched, including me." Williams nodded, already on his radio. The alley was secured, but the message had already been delivered. This wasn't a mugging. It wasn't a mistake. It was a direct warning, one not meant to scare Emily off, but to see how close they could get before she broke. They'd made a miscalculation, because if Harris's arrest had drawn blood, then this attack had opened the floodgates. Emily knew something now that changed the stakes entirely. The enemy wasn't hiding anymore. They were hunting. Back at the secure compound, Emily replayed the encounter in her mind while reviewing surveillance footage from the surrounding blocks. The silver-gray car had been caught in one frame, parked 3 blocks away just 10 minutes before the attack. DMV logs led nowhere. Stolen plates, naturally. But the phone recovered from the fleeing man told a different story. Encrypted messages, most wiped but not all. One phrase, repeated in a deleted draft, partially reconstructed by the tech team. "Confirm removal of C before end of cycle." See? They were talking about her, Emily Carter. The attack wasn't meant to succeed, just to signal readiness. A test run to confirm how hard they'd have to hit next time. But they had failed in one critical way. They'd underestimated her response. Emily wasn't backing down. She wasn't going dark. She was going on the offensive. That night, as the rain lifted and the city sank into exhausted silence, Emily stood alone in the analysis room, staring at a new map lit up on the screen. A spider web of communications between former officers, international firms, and flagged shell accounts still active despite Marquez's partial exposure. There was still movement, still coordination, and now her face had joined the target list. Emily didn't sleep that night. She drafted 3 interagency subpoenas, signed off on 2 overseas banking freeze requests, and launched a formal inquiry into recent breaches of federal witness protection protocols. All before dawn. This wasn't about fear anymore. It was about acceleration. If Marquez's network wanted war, they would have it, but not on their terms. Emily knew the rules better than they did. She'd spent years mapping out corruption from the inside, learning how these systems protected themselves. Now she was turning that knowledge into a weapon. She was no longer just investigating. She was dismantling, piece by piece, connection by connection. Behind her, the team regrouped. Thompson returned from brief surveillance recon. Williams traced the phone's metadata to a proxy server in Dubai. Nothing was off limits now. Every protocol was active, every line of inquiry open, and at the center of it all stood Emily. Not as a victim, not as a target, but as the storm they had just unleashed. The hunt had changed. They drew first blood. She would end it. The Montgomery County Jail was cold and quiet, as if time moved slower inside its walls. Emily stepped through the iron door, her shoes clicking sharply against the tile floor. She was there to see Jamal, her younger brother, serving a 5-year sentence for a drug case she'd long suspected was a setup. The visitation room was bare, with a cold aluminum table and 2 chairs placed opposite each other. Jamal was already seated, hands folded in front of his chest, eyes calm beyond his years, deeper than anyone his age should have had to endure. He looked at her like he'd already seen it all through the bars. The arrest, the struggle, the social media firestorm. Word of it all had made its way to prisoners through 100 channels of gossip and fragment. Emily sat down. She didn't hug him. The glass between them wasn't thick, but thick enough to keep all contact symbolic. She picked up the phone receiver that linked them through the divider. "You okay?" she asked. Jamal gave a slight smirk. "You're the one who should be asked that." He paused, then continued, gently but firmly. "You don't have to prove anything. You already are the proof." Emily swallowed a breath. In that moment, months of training, intelligence briefings, mafia boardroom infiltrations, all of it felt small under the gaze of her younger brother, a boy who had watched the system devour him, now giving his sister something she hadn't expected, strength. They sat in silence for a while, no need for many words. Their presence was enough. Emily had never forgotten Jamal, but today she truly saw him, not as a victim of the past, but as a witness, a survivor, a quiet testament to everything she was fighting for. Thompson had pushed her down. Harris had disappeared. 3 masked men ambushed her in the night. And now, here was Jamal, the boy who once drew robots with red pencils on the backs of receipts, who once trembled at the sight of flashing police lights just because their dad had run a yellow light. He sat thinner now, but his eyes were brighter than ever, bright in a quiet way, like someone who'd learned to live in darkness. "I think what happened to you changed how people see things," Jamal said, eyes locked on his sister. "Not because you're FBI, but because you didn't shout, and you still..." Emily said nothing. She didn't need to. She was looking at his hands. Long, dry fingers. A scratch on the second knuckle. Could have been from hitting a wall while playing basketball in the yard, or maybe from being dragged down a hallway one night. She didn't want to know. Knowing would keep her from sleeping. "Jamal," she whispered, "that day, who pulled you into it?" Her brother smiled faintly, the kind of smile people learn after years of living with suspicion. A smile meant to keep themselves intact. "There was a guy, Harris, Lieutenant Ronald Harris. He used to visit high schools, ran those cops and teens programs. I remember him. Gave me a mini handcuff keychain once." Emily stopped breathing. A few weeks later, I got randomly searched after lunch. There was a packet in my bag. Wasn't mine, but back then, who was going to believe a 17-year-old black kid in a hoodie? That sentence tore through Emily like a blade. Harris not just Marquez's mole, but the quiet hand that had manipulated the environment Jamal grew up in. He hadn't just sabotaged her mission, he had broken her brother's future, using the same instincts and procedures Thompson used on Emily at Delacroix. In her mind, everything came into focus. This wasn't 3 separate stories. It was a system, a pattern, a method standardized by power, disguised by paperwork, and supported by silence. Jamal looked at her. "You don't have to get revenge," he said. "I'm okay." Emily nodded. But she knew Jamal being okay wasn't the finish line. It was the starting point for a promise she would not break. She pressed her hand to the glass. That hand, once used to hold her skirt when they crossed the street, once wrapped around her waist during thunderstorms, once clenched around crayons while drawing childish dreams. Now it was thinner, rougher, but still her brother's hand. And Emily, for all her training, was still the big sister who owed him everything. "You won't be here forever, I promise." Jamal looked back. He didn't smile, didn't doubt. He nodded, like he'd already known that promise was coming. Not because she was FBI, not because she had cracked open crime networks, but because she was the only one who always showed up, who always kept her word, who walked through every neighborhood, every interrogation, every silent hallway, just to sit down and listen to someone the system had labeled trouble. Emily stood. Before leaving, she placed her other hand on the glass, a promise with no paperwork, no record, but deeper than any oath. When she stepped outside, the late sunlight spilled onto the prison's concrete walkway. It wasn't warm, but it cast her shadow long, and she knew she wasn't walking alone. Behind that shadow was Jamal, and behind Jamal, hundreds, thousands more like him, held back by systemic silence. Emily paused on the third step, pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with a message from Williams. "We've got a lead on Harris. Belize International Partners just opened a file." She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed her reply. "I'm still in Montgomery. One more thing I need to do." The wind moved through the trees in the prison yard. Leaves rustled like case files flipping open. But inside Emily, this wasn't just investigation anymore. It was excavation, digging through the ruins of what had shattered her family, torn apart her community, and clouded the meaning of justice she once believed in. This time, Emily wasn't coming back to react. She was coming back to lead, because her promise to Jamal wasn't just personal. It was the start of a rebuild, a redefinition of justice, one not rooted in skin, background, or records, but in truth. And she knew, if people like Harris had claimed the right to begin these stories unjustly, then she would be the one to rewrite the ending, this time in the light. Emily stepped slowly out of the field office after a long day of reviewing files. The air was crisp, the pale sunlight filtering through the branches of nearly bare trees. She didn't notice the man standing in the distance until her feet stopped instinctively. Thompson. He wasn't in uniform, just a wrinkled shirt, an old jacket, and a weariness in his eyes deeper than any expression she'd seen on him before. No arrogance, no defensiveness, just a man who had seen himself in a video and could no longer live the same way. Emily stayed still, less than 3 meters apart, but the space between them was heavy, filled with days of silence, prejudice, and that one time she'd been cuffed in public. She didn't speak. Thompson broke the silence first. "Not here for forgiveness." His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "I'm here because I need to fix what I broke." Emily didn't answer right away. The wind stirred her hair, her eyes locked on the man in front of her, waiting to see if he'd keep talking or turn away. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I believed in what they call cop instincts. But he let out a faint laugh, not to mask guilt, but to release it. "And I saw the mistake, right in your eyes. The moment I put those cuffs on you." Emily said nothing, but her heart eased, just slightly, not out of pity, because she knew standing still, facing your wrongs, took more than most could manage. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Thompson added. "I'm just hoping to do something right. This time, not through bias, through justice." Emily moved toward the door. As she passed him, she said one thing. "If you really want to fix it, don't tell me. Show me." And she walked on. Not fast, not slow, but every step struck the ground like a quiet warning. Redemption doesn't start with words. It starts with what you do next. Behind her, Thompson stood still, but no longer hung his head, as to resolve the unnecessary offer. Emily nodded and led Thompson into a small cafe near the bureau. The space was quiet, wooden tables, brick walls, a place where she usually reviewed intelligence reports away from public scrutiny. Today, the seat across from her belonged to the man who had almost cost her everything. Thompson pulled an old, worn file from his coat. The edges yellowed, the cover creased. "These are cases I worked on from 2018 to 2022. Some files are missing, some were dropped for lack of evidence, but I recorded everything I remembered, and I need you to read them from the other side." Emily took the file without a word. She flipped through the pages, reasons for arrests, suspicious behavior, conclusions, penalties. Some names were familiar, some stories she had once doubted, now clear as day. "You want to help solve cases?" she asked, eyes sharp. Thompson nodded. "I'm no longer a cop, but I was in the system. I know how it works, and how it twists." I can show you where the cracks are. It's through bias? No, through justice. They met again the next morning in a different cafe. This one tucked in an older part of the city. Emily sat in the corner, back to the door, eyes on the fogged-up window. She hadn't ordered, just sipped black tea, waiting. Thompson arrived on time, calm. He sat across from her, a thicker file in hand. This time he didn't put it down right away. He held it, hesitant. These are cases from 2018 to now, he said, finally setting the file on the old wooden table. Cases I questioned, and some I never did. Now, I need someone to look at them with fresh eyes, not to clear me, to expose them. Emily turned a few pages. The names: male, female, varying ages, mostly people of color. Notes like suspicious behavior, non-cooperative, inconsistent gestures. She'd seen hundreds of reports like these, but never from someone who'd signed them, now volunteering to revisit. "What do you want from me?" she asked, still looking at the pages. "Just a chance," Thompson said. "I can't command anymore. I can't patrol, but I have experience. I know the system, and I know how it shielded me." Emily looked up. For the first time, her eyes weren't cold, but they weren't soft either. "What can you help me with?" Thompson took a breath. "I want to help track Harris and others like him, the ones not caught on video, the ones still operating, still burying kids, like Jamal, under piles of case files." Emily didn't answer immediately, but she closed the file and kept it beside her. "You won't be a partner, but you'll be a second pair of eyes, a view from the inside." Thompson nodded. "No thanks, no extra words." They left the cafe as the sun began to rise. Morning light touched the old files, and something new, not full trust, but the willingness to walk together if he was truly ready to make it right. The real work begins. Monday morning, Emily called Thompson into a small back room at the field office. On the table, a city map, flagged financial trails, and a list of officers repeatedly named in complaints that had never led to disciplinary action. Thompson looked at the names and went still. He knew many, former colleagues, even friends. "Are you ready to face the ones who used to back you up?" Emily asked. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it didn't flinch. "I think that's the first thing I need to do if I don't want to be that man again," Thompson replied without hesitation. Emily slid a file toward him. "These are the cases where Harris might have interfered. I need you to reverse engineer the system, match the patterns you've seen from the inside." He nodded, hand resting on the folder like it held a piece of memory he'd tried to forget. She saw his hand tremble, not from fear, but from knowing the cost of what he was about to do. "You don't have to be a good man in anyone's eyes," Emily said. "Just be right. From now on." They worked through the morning, neither saying much. Emily checked intel from Williams. Thompson marked connections, flagged patterns, revealed blind spots no outsider would catch. By noon, Emily stood to make more coffee. When she returned, she found Thompson staring out the window. His eyes no longer looked weighed down. "I never thought I'd be sitting here," he said quietly, "across from someone I once arrested, just because of how I saw her." Emily didn't smile, but she said, "And I never thought I'd let someone like you sit here." But justice doesn't start with perfection. It starts with honesty. The session ended with Emily writing one simple line on the whiteboard. "Truth is the only foundation strong enough to rebuild trust." For the first time in years, Thompson nodded, not to agree, but because, finally, he understood. Marquez Foundation Charity Gala unfolded inside the grand ballroom of the Belle Grand Hotel, where gold leaf ceilings and crystal chandeliers glowed over tailored tuxedos and flowing evening gowns. Everything was designed to radiate power, from the overpriced wine and live jazz to the precision smiles of the serving staff. Emily entered looking every bit the successful executive, a sleek black dress with a high slit, hair in a tight bun, a light smile just warm enough to avoid suspicion but distant enough to discourage conversation. Thompson walked beside her, disguised as a cybersecurity investor, silver silk tie, fitted suit, unrecognizable from his usual self. They didn't need to talk much. Both had learned to read a room with their eyes. Emily scanned the space, mentally mapping out key positions, emergency exits, fixed security cameras, and, most importantly, the VIP zone, where Marquez stood toasting a few unknown figures the FBI hadn't yet identified. He's left of the stage, near the third table, Emily murmured into the mic hidden in her earring. Got him. There's a guy with a green emerald ring talking to him. Salt and pepper hair. Not in the files. Thompson replied through the mic wired into his shirt button. There were no signs of criminal activity at the party, but Emily knew better. Major laundering operations didn't go down in dark alleys. They began with crystal glasses and unrecorded handshakes. Toward the end of the night, a staff member slipped backstage. Emily followed, pretending to take a call, and slipped through a side door into a restricted hallway. Thompson stayed by the entrance, maintaining line of sight and open channels. A small room behind the stage revealed itself. Inside, Marquez was speaking to two men. One of them had a laptop open, projecting a detailed chart of financial transfers through offshore shell companies. Emily couldn't hear them clearly, but she didn't need to. A micro recorder was already hidden beneath her dress seam. All she had to do was get close enough to the door. The signal was strong enough to capture the conversation. She stood still in the dim corridor, like a shadow among giants. The recording rolled. Words drifted through the door. The funds will move from Belize through Panama. 3-tiered accounts, clean as glass. Emily's hand tightened. The pieces were locking into place. And this time, she wouldn't let them slip. The room didn't appear on any hotel blueprints. Emily knew that. She'd studied the archived layouts. No one but insiders knew it existed. That made what she was recording all the more valuable. She pressed her back to the wall, breath shallow but eyes sharp. Behind the soundproof door, Marquez kept talking, his voice confident, certain, the voice of a man who thought everyone nearby had been cleared. We've cleared the path in Belize. Panama's just a springboard. From there, the money flows through Singapore, then legit in Zurich. Legal team already set up a temp account in Liechtenstein, said the man with the emerald ring. It'll be clean in 2 weeks. Emily barely breathed, not out of fear, but because she knew she'd just heard what 3 months of investigation hadn't uncovered. Marquez's primary laundering route. A soft click. The third man plugged a USB into the laptop. The screen shifted, a dashboard full of transactional details. Emily quietly triggered her belt mount mini camera. Not just audio. She needed visuals, irrefutable proof. Then Marquez's voice lowered. The FBI woman? She's still in the city? The man with the ring smirked. If needed, I can clear the path. Emily's expression didn't change, but her chest tightened. The clock was ticking. From afar, the jazz resumed, its smooth rhythm a mask for what was unfolding behind the velvet. The party continued. Champagne poured, small talk flowed. But here, beneath the silk and gold, a crime was being orchestrated. Emily stepped back, removed her earpiece. She whispered into the mic. Thompson, feeds live, visuals locked, ready to exit. Thompson's voice came through, steady. Go. I've got the outside. Exit 3 is open. Emily dropped her mic from her collar, walking swiftly toward exit 3. The heels she wore for show now struck the dim hallway like steel. She didn't run, but her stride was unwavering, like a silent dare. Just before the door, she stopped. A man stood in her path. No uniform, no name tag, not on the security list. Lost, ma'am? He asked, voice smooth, almost silk, but Emily heard the violence beneath it. She didn't respond. Her eyes scanned his hands. No visible weapon, but his stance was trained. Excuse me, she said, voice calm but firm. He stepped forward, his first mistake. Emily pivoted, shifted her weight, and used her left arm to push his shoulder, her right hand snapping open a hidden restraint looped under her coat. In under 3 seconds, he was pinned to the wall, speechless. She whispered in his ear, "Tell Marquez, the FBI woman's still here." Before he could react, she backed away, opened the door, and disappeared through it. Thompson waited at the far end of the service hall. They bolted down the stairwell, leaving behind the swell of jazz, climbing to its final crescendo. In the car, Emily removed the earpiece, slipped the recorder from her dress, and transferred the data to an encrypted drive. "Got it all?" Thompson asked as the car merged into traffic. "Audio, video, and a direct threat to a federal agent," she confirmed. Thompson nodded and pressed the gas. "Then it's time for phase 2. Emily stared straight ahead. She wasn't the woman who had just walked out of a charity gala. She was a soldier, and she knew in her gut, in those final seconds, what kept her standing wasn't a weapon. It wasn't her training. It was faith. Faith that the truth always finds a way out. The ballroom lights spilled into the back hallway like a coat of shimmering paint, masking every crack beneath. Emily and Thompson moved through the thinning crowd with calculated care, each step measured, as if one wrong glance could shatter everything. From the far left corner, near a secondary bar, a man in a server's uniform adjusted a tray of glasses. His eyes swept the room casually, but when they landed on Emily, his hand froze for half a second. She was mid-conversation with an elderly guest, smiling softly, fully in character. But that face, he'd seen it, not from an official file but a TikTok clip, the one where she was arrested at Delacroix, eyes defiant. He turned away smoothly, slipping his hand into his pocket to send a quick message. Still here. Black, slit dress, hair up, with a tall guy, silver tie, black. At the same moment, Emily gently pulled her hand away from the champagne flute, eyes shifting. She spotted him, not his face, but his movement. Too quick, too sharp for regular staff. A signal fired in her head. "We've got a problem," she whispered into her mic. Thompson didn't look at her, just subtly shifted his stance, his hand drifting toward the holstered gun. "I see him. Nearest exit's through the kitchen hallway." Emily nodded slightly, beginning to drift toward the service area. But as she neared the door, the air shifted, thickened. 2 unfamiliar men stood near the exit, dressed sharply, but not eating, not drinking. One had a thin scar running from his ear to his jaw. She'd seen that face in criminal files. She didn't turn back. She just nudged Thompson toward the kitchen with her shoulder. "No time, move." They slipped through a side door between catering shifts. No one screamed. No one ran. But Emily knew. The chase had begun. The kitchen became a maze. Gleaming steel tables, industrial fridges, steaming pots sending up clouds of vapor. A perfect fog for pursuit. Billy led, weaving between spice racks, ducking a falling pan, kicking open a swinging door. Thompson followed close, toppling a rack of glasses behind them as a makeshift barricade. Footsteps pounded behind, faster, closer. Spanish voices barked short commands, blending with clanging pots into a chaotic symphony of adrenaline. Emily and Thompson didn't speak. Their only language, action. A glance, a nod, a synchronized sidestep. As they rounded the prep station, a man leapt from the shadows. Emily didn't pause. She grabbed a steel pan and struck him across the head. A sharp clang. Then the body dropped. "Freezer hallway!" Thompson yelled, pointing to a steel door at the back. They sprinted, chased by closing footsteps. The door opened to a massive cold storage room. Shelves towering with crates and ice blocks. They darted between aisles, slipping through narrow passages, breath steaming in the freezing air. A bullet zinged off a metal shelf, sparks flaring. Emily shoved Thompson down and crawled toward a staircase leading to a mezzanine, the employee escape hatch. They scrambled up the stairs and pushed through a service door onto a side rooftop. Ahead, a cargo chute that spiraled down to the loading bay below. Thompson looked at her. "We're really sliding down that?" Emily didn't answer. She jumped. Thompson followed. Cold metal screamed under their bodies as they flew down the chute. They hit the ground at the back of the hotel, staggered but upright. Emily immediately pulled the recorder from her dress. The green light blinked. Data's intact. A noise behind them. One of the pursuers emerged from the emergency door. Emily didn't flinch. She pulled out pepper spray and blasted it straight into his face. He screamed, slipped, and tumbled back down. They didn't wait. Thompson grabbed her arm, and they bolted for a black SUV parked in the corner. The doors slammed shut, just as Emily hit the passenger's seat. Thompson floored the gas. The SUV roared, tires squealing as they sped out of the lot and into the back alley behind the Belgrand Hotel. No one spoke. One word might shatter the fragile focus keeping them alive. Engine growling, streetlights streaked by like smears of motion. There were no sirens behind them yet, but the air was thick with the scent of pursuit. Emily panted, checking the recorder again. Light, green, audio, secure, minicam footage, syncing to backup storage, all intact. They're not following, Thompson said, checking the rearview, but they'll find us soon enough. Doesn't matter, Emily replied, breath steadying. We've got everything we need. The SUV turned sharply into the gated lot of a hidden FBI warehouse, where a digital security team waited. Emily stepped out like she'd just left a boardroom, not a chase scene. No one could tell she'd just fought for her life in a kitchen full of knives and boiling soup. Inside, the room glowed under sterile white lights. Emily handed the recorder to the technician. Sometimes, encrypt, upload to central server, keep a backup in deep freeze. Codes streamed down the monitors, fast and alive, feeding into the FBI's central command. Behind her, Thompson stood quietly. No one thanked him, but Emily turned to him, gave a single nod. For the first time in this entire mission, he saw something in her eyes. Not forgiveness, but recognition. Phase 2 just started, she said. Thompson nodded. I've chosen my side. It's not about choosing, Emily corrected. This time, you're just standing where you should have been all along. Lieutenant Ronald Harris never imagined that the door he opened that morning would mark the beginning of the end, not just for him, but for an entire web of power, secrecy, and betrayal. The federal strike team arrived at exactly 5:42 a.m. No sirens, no drawn weapons, no chance to run. Just one black SUV stopping quietly outside his immaculately trimmed lawn, followed by 7 precise footsteps through the steel gate. The air was unnervingly still, as if the house itself sensed what was coming. Inside, the hallway lights were dimmed. The kitchen clock ticked. A pot of old coffee sat lukewarm on the counter. Harris, in a loosely tied robe, eyes heavy from a late night of encrypted calls and shredded documents, opened the door, expecting silence. Instead, he was met with 2 badges and a warrant. Federal agents, we have a warrant to search and arrest, one of them stated with cold clarity. Harris didn't protest. He didn't ask why. He simply turned his back, walked 2 steps inside, and placed his phone, the same one he used to run silent operations, manage side accounts, and coordinate off-the-record forcements, onto a shelf as if surrendering a crown. Then came the cuffs, and in the silence that followed, he asked one question without turning his head. Who betrayed me? No one answered. But in the following weeks, Emily would re-watch the arrest footage over and over, pausing each time at the same moment, when Harris's eyes shifted from defiance to realization. It wasn't fear she saw. It was the quiet, concentrated rage of a man who had spent years moving with impunity, now forced to look a world he manipulated in the eye and realize it no longer bent for him. As the SUV pulled away, the suburban neighborhood remained undisturbed. No curious neighbors stepping out in robes, no barking dogs, no alarms. The only witness was the glint of morning dew on the windows and the brief flicker of headlights that cut across sleeping lawns. No one knew that the man being driven out, who once hosted city officials at Christmas parties, who authorized covert surveillance files and suppression campaigns with a nod, was now being processed like a common felon. At the federal data center, Emily received the custody alert while reviewing a decryption queue for Marquise's drives. When she saw Harris's name flash on the screen, she didn't cheer or even smile, just whispered 2 words as if releasing a breath she'd been holding for too long. At last. Behind her, Thompson stood watching. He remembered the Harris of old, sharp, revered, commanding. But memory is a liar when fed by illusion. The truth was always there, waiting to be seen. Harris's authority wasn't built on merit, but on a system conditioned to look the other way. A system where fear, politics, and silence outweighed justice. But now, justice had a team, and Harris had no more hiding places left. The interrogation didn't begin with questions. It began with stillness. Interrogation Room 4 had no windows, only soft overhead light and a temperature set precisely to unsettle. Not enough to notice, but just cold enough to discomfort. Harris sat motionless for 12 minutes, saying nothing, barely blinking. Emily let him stew. She sent in Thompson first, not to interrogate, but to watch. That's what cracked Harris. Thompson, once a passive participant in the old order, now sat across from him, with no badge, no pretense, just the weight of a man finally choosing the right side. "You sold me out," Harris hissed. "No," Thompson replied evenly. "I'm fixin' what should have been fixed years ago." That line lingered. Harris, now isolated and stripped of his power armor, began to speak, slowly at first, then in a trickle, then in a torrent. He wasn't confessing. He was negotiating. Every name he dropped, every dollar traced, every shell company uncovered. It wasn't remorse, it was leverage. But to Emily, even leverage could lead to light. She entered last. No files, no legal team, just a single printed transaction. One of many. She placed it on the table like a blade. "This is the first piece," she said, her voice sharp but calm. "There are 27 more waiting for decryption, but I figured you'd want to talk before we get there." Harris smirked, but for the first time she noticed it didn't reach his eyes. "You're bluffing," he said. Emily didn't blink. "Try me." Then silence. For 5 full minutes. "What do you want to know?" What followed in the next 6 hours was a dissection of an empire. Every answer Harris gave unlocked 3 new paths. Wire transfers traced through ghost charities. Business donations rerouted through family trusts. Internal audit trails wiped by rogue IT personnel now suddenly made sense. His testimony, recorded and routed in real time to federal financial crime analysts, lit up the evidence boards like a nerve network exposed. Each connection illuminated in red. Campaign donors turned money launderers, community foundations used as pass-throughs, overseas accounts that pinged at precisely the same time as internal PD decisions. Marquez's name came up again, but this time it wasn't just whispers. It was time stamps, signatures, video fragments from back-channel meetings at exclusive clubs, cross-referenced with encrypted calendars. Thompson, now assigned to internal log audits, uncovered 3 senior officers complicit in concealing flows. None resisted when called in. They didn't ask for lawyers. They didn't plead oversight. They just left, with resignation letters so hastily written they weren't even signed. No one in the command chain spoke their names again. They were ghosts now, and the system that once protected them was cracking open like a vault left too long in the sun. By Sunday night, the data war room glowed with activity. Whiteboards covered in scribbled names, arrows and figures, digital maps showing cross-setter transfers, triangulated by new whistleblower tips and Harris's input. No one mentioned Harris anymore. He was just a node in the system now. Marquez's influence, once untouchable, was now bleeding out in real time. Funds froze in Zurich. A bank in Panama refused access to 2 key accounts. An asset firm in Belize retracted a press statement and wiped its server cache. Emily watched as the wall of names, dates, and numbers grew denser, but cleaner. Order from chaos. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the marker and wrote a new line at the top of the board. Justice is not an act, it's a process that cannot stop. No one clapped. There was no final speech, no call to celebrate. But when she stepped back, Thompson, Williams, and 2 younger agents in their first federal assignment stood beside her. Not because they were told to, but because they believed. It wasn't over. Marquez was still out there, but this time he knew. The net wasn't theoretical anymore, it was tightening, and for once, he wasn't writing the rules of the end game. The search warrant was approved at 3:12 a.m. No fanfare, no flashing lights, just a 2-page document with 3 signatures, enough to unseal doors most believed untouchable. Emily was the first to receive it. She read every line carefully, then nodded to Williams. Initiate. Inside the command center, the air thickened. Every move was calculated, every command sharp and short like a knife cut. Team 1 in position. Team 2 moving. Team 3 holds perimeter. Marquez Capital's headquarters, nestled in the city's financial district, was built like a fortress. Reflective glass walls, multi-tiered security systems, and 2 underground data vaults. But Emily knew. The tighter the seal, the clearer the evidence inside. No convoys of agents lining the street. They split into groups, entering from 3 access points: the main entrance, parking level, and service lift. All building surveillance was blurred out within 3 seconds by a high-level digital tool. While Marquez slept soundly, the game had already changed. On the 3rd floor, his private office, where he once charmed investors with French wine and florid promises, Emily stepped in for the first time, not as a negotiator, but as the law. She recalled Harris's confession. The 3rd floor is the heart of it. A decoy interior concealed a secondary server. Emily signaled the tech unit to begin scanning for drive activity, while another team secured the blind spot. The room smelled cold. White stone floors, tailored finishes, like Marquez's personality, control wrapped in elegance. But Emily wasn't here to admire decor. She watched the clock. 5:18 a.m. 2 minutes before the official warrant would be read aloud. 2 minutes before the truth would no longer hide behind glass. As the breach team neared the 3rd floor, Emily took point. No shouting, just one clear command in her comms. Go time. Inside, the system trembled. Not from explosives, from the layers of false security peeling away. Marquez was already awake when the internal access alert pinged. Just a soft ting from the system's unauthorized access alarm. He knew instantly what it meant. No time for swagger. He sprang up, pulling the hard drive from behind the decorative hourglass mural. Wipe it, he told his assistant, whose hands trembled over the keyboard. All of it. Nothing left behind. She typed frantically. Eyes lowered, code lines ran across the screen, files deleted in seconds, but neither knew. The encrypted backups had already been extracted, courtesy of Emily's last infiltration. Glass shattered, a sound like a gunshot. The reinforced 3rd floor window burst under pressure. The tactical unit flooded in. No wasted words, full gear, precision. Emily led the charge. The tactical light on her rifle lit up Marquez's face. He froze. Not in fear, but disbelief. The woman he once saw handcuffed at his feet now stood before him, reading out his charges. Emily said, voice level and unshakable. You are under arrest for transnational money laundering, bribery of public officials, manipulation of financial systems, and destruction of federal evidence. He squinted. You. This time, Emily said, I asked the questions. 2 agents cuffed him. No resistance, but his eyes darted, scanning for a power play that no longer existed. Pointless. Thompson entered moments later with a federal order to seize all servers and external devices. The hard drive slipped from Marquez's hand, thudding against the floor. Emily bent down, picked it up, checked the signal. We've got a backup, she said. And this time, no one's covering for you. The room fell silent. The clock on the wall kept ticking, a cold beat marking the collapse of an empire. Marquez was led out, his pace slower than usual. No press waiting to praise, no stage to perform philanthropy, just a long hallway where every step chipped away at his illusion of immunity. Emily watched him go, not with triumph, not relief, just the awareness. This was one necessary step, a step that should have come long ago. News of the arrest spread faster than any morning bulletin. Networks cut scheduled programming. Media helicopters circled Marquez Capital within 40 minutes of the takedown. As he was escorted through the lobby, once decorated with posters of community campaigns, camera flashes lit up the air. Reporters shouted over one another, reaching for a statement. But Marquez said nothing. No bowed head, no turned face. just a figure stripped of protection. Money no longer his armor. Emily didn't step into the spotlight. She stood on the second floor, behind a frosted window, watching the chaos below. Her face remained still, but in her eyes, more than any indictment could ever write. Thompson approached, handed her a coffee. "This isn't over," he said. Emily took the cup, nodding. "I know, but it's the best start we've had." Outside, the crowd kept growing. People once silent, once doubtful, were now talking, sharing, questioning. Justice doesn't arrive overnight, but that night, at least, it showed up on time and in the right hands. Emily turned away before Marquez reached the car. She knew the moment didn't lie in seeing him driven off. It was in the encrypted data now secured, in the testimonies being verified, in the team she was leading, step by step, cutting through the dense dust of power to bring clarity. No applause followed the arrest, but in a small room on the second floor, someone sat quietly, knowing justice isn't what fills the primetime news. It's the quiet resolve that remains when the noise dies down. Emily stood before the mirror, adjusting the lapel of her deep navy blazer. This wasn't a criminal trial. No jury, no sentence, but for her it was the toughest stage yet, an internal law enforcement hearing, a room where voices like hers had long been dismissed with the phrase, "lacks objectivity." The mirror reflected a woman who had endured and who had grown used to being judged for everything but her capability, her skin, her gender, her silence when insulted, because she wasn't allowed to push back. The prep room behind the fifth-floor hallway of City Hall was simple. One chair, a bottle of water, and warm yellow lighting. Emily didn't need more. She had with her the Delacroix internal case file, an independent human rights report, and a presentation written over weeks of sleepless nights. She heard Thompson's footsteps behind her. He didn't answer, just stood in the doorway, nodded. No luck wishes, no pep talk, just presence. As always, Emily stepped into the corridor. The air was thick like wet cement. She was about to face high-ranking officers, people who had once nodded through her de-escalation trainings, who once praised her as a symbol, until she dared to speak up. A board listing the day's hearings showed only one item under internal review and reform, the Delacroix incident and consequences. Her name stood alone. She paused outside the hearing room, took a breath. In her mind flashed Jamal, handcuffed behind a school, a mother crying, unsure how to teach her son what to avoid, and herself, once branded suspicious for sitting alone in a luxury restaurant. She wasn't here to fight anymore. That fight was done. Today she came to lay a foundation, to make change more than a slogan. She opened the door and walked in. Behind a wooden podium, Emily faced a long row of senior officers, prosecutors, and community representatives. No notes, no screens, just her voice, calm and direct, not to defend herself, but to tell the truth. She began with that night at Delacroix. No outrage, no raised voice, just facts. A black woman having dinner, a biased stare, cuffs wrongly used, a system that watched and stayed silent. "I wasn't there as a civilian," she said. "I was a federal agent. On assignment." Silence. Then she continued, "If an agent can be treated that way because no one knew who she was, imagine those without a badge, a camera, or a witness." She spoke of Jamal, her brother, stopped after school for looking suspicious, the kids from her workshops who flinched at flashing lights. Her voice was steady, precise. "I'm not here to represent a movement," she said. "I'm here because I lived it. I stayed silent through it, and I've seen the damage it causes." She cited the report. People of color, 3 times more likely to face administrative stops. 82% of discrimination complaints dismissed internally. Officer misconduct investigations averaging 14 months, during which officers remained armed and active. No slogans, no blame. But the room couldn't look away when she described being slammed into a wall, not for what she did, but for who she was. "This isn't my story," she concluded. "It's a fault line in the system, and I can't be silent and still call myself a servant of justice." When she stepped back, no one spoke, but something in the air had shifted. Then came her proposal, not rhetoric, but reform. practical, detailed, and urgent. First, training reform. Mandatory modules on unconscious bias, nonviolent communication, and de-escalation strategies. Not just how to control, but how not to need control. We can't expect fair enforcement from officers who've never been taught how to recognize injustice. Second, accountability. Biannual psychological evaluations, random video audits. Peer reviews not just top-down, but bottom-up. And, most critical, an independent oversight board. Outside the police structure, this board would have full access to complaints, the power to reopen cases and suspend officers for racial profiling, excessive force, or obstructing citizen recordings. She showed data from other cities. It worked. She paused, then looked each panel member in the eye. You may not agree with me, but if you've ever been stopped for your name, your look, or your silence, you'll understand. Justice can't wait another generation. She ended. No applause. No tears. Just the kind of silence that follows when truth hits deep. As she left the room, a few people stood. Not out of protocol, but because, for the first time in a long time, change had been offered not to polish a system's image, but to change its core. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most hopeful sign law enforcement had seen in years. On the first morning after Emily's hearing, Thompson sat alone in the old briefing room at the Montgomery Police Department, a space that once echoed with orders, strategy briefings, and locker room laughter, now thick with silence. The same coffee cup, the one with the faded department logo and the small chip near the handle, sat beside him, cold, forgotten. He didn't remember pouring it, nor did he care. The room was as familiar as his own skin. The faded paint, the bulletin board layered in old memos and new warnings, the laminated mission statement still tacked above the whiteboard like a motto from a world that never quite existed. On the wall were his commendations, photos of team-building retreats, plaques for service excellence, relics of a man who once believed that keeping order meant keeping everything exactly as it was. He remembered his younger self in those photos, shoulders squared, rules memorized, pride in his step. But pride had turned to doubt, and doubt had turned to truth, the kind you can't unsee, and it wasn't Emily who broke him. It wasn't the headlines, the protest signs, or the Twitter storms. It was the simple, unbearable weight of memory. Memory with eyes, names, and consequences. He'd heard his own voice in body cam footage played during her testimony. Not cruel, but indifferent, and that was the sharper blade. He had enforced the system not because he hated anyone, but because he'd stopped questioning it. He didn't notice when judgment replaced instinct. He didn't see when compliance became his only standard. But now, he did. That morning, Thompson stood up, walked down the hallway he used to own with quiet authority, and placed his badge, warm from his pocket, on the captain's desk. No ceremony, no rage, just a note. Handwritten and unpolished. I'm no longer inside the system, but I haven't left the fight. No one followed him out, and he didn't look back. Weeks later, Thompson showed up quietly at a community forum in a high school gym, the kind with folding chairs, lukewarm coffee, and handwritten name tags. The event was organized by Emily and a coalition of advocacy groups designed to bring former law enforcement and black residents into the same room, not to reconcile, but to reckon. Thompson didn't take the mick. He didn't make an entrance. He sat in the third row, pen in hand, listening. Story after story poured out, some angry, some broken, all real. A man described being dragged out of his car for non-compliance because he reached for his insurance. A woman described how her son had been arrested on school grounds and still flinched at the sound of keys. Thompson scribbled notes, but nothing he wrote could fully hold what he heard. Then a boy stood up, maybe 14, skinny arms, steady voice. "Were you a cop?" he asked. "Did you ever arrest someone just because of their skin color?" The air in the room went still. Thompson met the boy's gaze and didn't flinch. "Yes," he said, "because back then I didn't have the courage to ask why I was doing it." No applause. No outrage, just truth. That night changed everything. Thompson began volunteering with a nonprofit group researching racial bias and policing. He turned down every salary offer. All he asked was to be placed where it mattered, in rooms with people who didn't owe him forgiveness. "Let me sit with the people I once hurt," he told them, "even if I didn't mean to." He worked long hours auditing use-of-force reports, reviewing de-escalation videos, helping rewrite sections of field manuals he once memorized without question. Alongside Emily, he co-authored new training modules that didn't just teach procedures, but forced officers to confront how perception is shaped by bias, how judgment isn't always justice. He didn't use his rank, didn't ask for a title. When introduced, he would simply say, "I'm someone learning all over again." Late one night, Emily stepped into the shared office space they used for reform work and slid a file across the desk. "Harris," she said, "you trusted him. You were once like him. So what do you want to do about the ones who are still asleep?" Thompson stared at the name on the folder. James Harris, a former patrol partner, now under internal review for repeated misconduct, hidden under clever paperwork. Thompson didn't respond right away. He took the file, closed his laptop, and went home. The next morning, he showed up at a regional police training session with no slides, no script. He introduced himself not as a trainer, but as a man trying to undo his own silence. For 2 hours, he told raw, unfiltered stories of mistakes made, of instincts never questioned, of people hurt not by malice, but by systems designed to He didn't ask them to feel guilty, he asked them to feel responsible. "Cops don't have to be perfect," he told the room, "but we don't get to keep getting it wrong and calling that normal." Recruits wrote it down, a few underlined it, some didn't, but he kept showing up, every week, every precinct. He dissected real case studies with them, including Jamal's. He let them question him, challenge him, even disagree. "If you're more afraid of being called racist than of being racist," he once said, "you're not ready to carry a bag." He didn't say it with anger. He said it with clarity, the kind earned through quiet, persistent reckoning. The Harris file became a catalyst, not just for one investigation, but for a larger truth. The system doesn't need more defenders, it needs more defectors who stay and clean up the mess. Months later, at a national conference on policing reform in Washington, D.C., Thompson and Emily sat side by side on stage under soft amber lights. It was the first time he had been publicly introduced as a former officer who chose to face his past. The room filled with attorneys, civil rights leaders, law students, and a few uneasy chiefs applauded. Not politely, earnestly. But Thompson didn't bow his head either. He kept his gaze steady, because he understood something most people miss. Change doesn't live in applause. It doesn't live in the big moments. Real change lives in the next shift, in the way an officer responds when they feel disrespected, in the tone of voice they use during a stop, in the decision to de-escalate when everything in their training tells them to dominate. It lives in the smallest acts, the ones that don't make the news, the ones no one celebrates. "We've spent decades preparing officers for combat," Thompson said on stage. "Now we need to prepare them for community." When it was over, he and Emily didn't stay for the banquet. They walked out together into the quiet of the Capitol night. "The next generation may never know our names," she said, "but if they don't have to fight the same battles, that'll be enough." Thompson nodded, his voice soft but sure. "Justice doesn't need statues. It just needs people who show up, even when it's hardest." And with that, they parted ways. Not because the work was done, but because it was just beginning. Monday morning, an email appeared in Emily's official inbox. The subject line was simple: Jamal Carter case, review for retrial. She opened it in silence, her eyes scanning every word while her hands froze mid-keystroke. This was the moment she had expected for years. Yet when it finally arrived, it landed like a tremor in her chest, unsettling, sharp, real. The name in the subject line wasn't just a case file. It was blood. It was memory. It was the boy she used to protect from school bullies, the young man whose voice she hadn't heard since his transfer to a juvenile facility years ago. Part of her had trained for this day, gone through law school, endured grueling nights as an assistant U.S. attorney, even changed departments to get closer to reform. But readiness is not immunity. When the past comes knocking in the language of legal review, it doesn't arrive as a courtesy. It arrives as a reckoning. Emily stood up, walked past the office windows with their filtered city light, and went straight to the mirror room in her apartment. A small chamber with nothing but a high-backed chair, a tall standing mirror, and cold white light from an overhead fixture. This wasn't a space for vanity. It was for facing the truth. She often came here before major trials or internal reviews, a place to silence external noise and study her own expression. But today wasn't for rehearsing answers or steadying her breath. Today was for bearing witness to herself. In the mirror, she saw a woman stripped of the illusions she once held the night her brother was taken. No longer naive, no longer complicit through silence. This reflection didn't belong to someone who merely endured the system. It belonged to someone who had survived it and still chose to walk back inside. Her hand reached out, fingertips brushing the cold glass. Outside, the world moved on. Meetings held, files circulated, lines of code processed data across servers. But inside this room, the only thing that mattered was the question Jamal had once asked her with tearless eyes: when will you help others not end up like me? She hadn't answered then. She didn't have the words. But now, her hand tightened slightly against the glass. She had her answer. Memories poured in like floodwaters breaching old walls. The nights she visited Jamal in the detention center, the fluorescent lights casting sterile shadows across his bunk, the way he would smile through cracked lips and tell her stories, not about what happened to him, but what he saw happening to others, boys his age, some younger, some never convicted, already speaking like lifers. He once told her how he got stopped at age 12 because he looked suspicious while walking home from school. The officer never explained what was suspicious, only that he fit a description. A teacher had once called the police because Jamal forgot his ID. He was escorted out like a threat. She remembered thinking back then, this can't be normal. But no one called it out. Not loud enough, not long enough. Now, standing on the other side of that silence, Emily knew what had to be done. She left the mirror room and picked up the phone. The family attorney answered on the second ring. "We need every original document," she said, her voice calm but hard-edged, "and Jamal's notebook, all of it." That same day, she returned to the office earlier than usual, bypassing her usual workflow to dive straight into the archives. She pulled out file after file, statements from that year, transcribed interviews, hall pass logs, medical reports from the juvenile center. She wasn't searching for gaps. She was mapping them. What was once used to label Jamal a problem student now read like a record of institutional failure. She saw it all clearly now, how bias compounded over time, how documentation became weaponized against black youth, how bureaucratic silence gave cover to targeted harm. But this time, every page was more than a record. It was a thread, and Emily was weaving a path back to justice. By early afternoon, a new task force had begun forming under her direction. Not sanctioned yet, not formalized through department memos, but real nonetheless. It started with a call to Thompson, a former investigator she trusted. When he arrived, he carried under his arm a psychological evaluation. The officer who had arrested Jamal had 2 prior warnings on record, both within 3 months before the incident. "No follow-up, no oversight," Thompson said flatly, placing the file on her desk. Emily didn't flinch. She opened the report, read it, and nodded once. "Then we'll do what they didn't." Audio files were recovered, some discarded, some mislabeled. Hallway camera footage, long thought deleted, had fragments that could corroborate Jamal's account. Old emails between faculty members revealed more than negligence. They showed the slow, corrosive spread of assumption disguised as policy. Every document they uncovered became a brick in the foundation she was now laying, not for Jamal alone, but for every other name buried under silence. Emily's team knew the stakes. She didn't need to repeat them. By evening, she stood alone in the strategy room, the walls filled with photos, handwritten annotations, timelines. Her eyes paused on a single image. Jamal, smiling at 16, his birthday cake glowing with candles he hadn't yet blown out. There was no anger in her expression, not anymore. Only a resolute clarity that refused to dim. The system had never once apologized to her brother. But Emily wasn't here to beg for remorse. She was here to dismantle excuses, to challenge the process from within, and to make sure that when justice arrived, it would not come quietly, it would come. This wasn't redemption. This was responsibility. Emily knew the difference. She didn't believe in overnight change. She didn't pretend one retrial could repair years of misjudgment. But that didn't mean it wasn't worth doing. Real justice, she had learned, wasn't a moment. It was a process made of thousands of deliberate, uncomfortable choices. It was waking up and doing the work, especially when no one's watching. And this time, she wasn't acting from the outside. She wasn't a sister shouting through glass walls. She was the one writing the policy, guiding the reviews, reshaping the structure from the inside out. And the irony? She had once worn handcuffs, not as a criminal, but as a victim of assumption. That officer, years ago, had judged her the same way they'd judged Jamal, by appearance, by race. He hadn't seen a federal agent, he'd seen a threat, and he'd acted on it. But where he saw threat, Emily had built resolve. Where he offered silence, she offered proof. Now, it was her turn, her time. She wasn't seeking revenge, she was seeking clarity. And through that clarity, she'd become what no one expected. A force that wouldn't be silenced. A voice within the machine that refused to echo the past. The retrial was only the beginning. The real case was much bigger, the system itself. And this time, the verdict would be different. Emily Carter's story isn't just a personal journey through prejudice. It's a mirror held up to how deeply bias can thread itself through institutions and how a system, no matter how flawed, can be changed from within, if someone has the clarity and courage to demand it. What happened to her was not extraordinary in the sense of being rare. It was extraordinary because, unlike so many others who suffer quietly or are crushed by it, she chose to confront it, not with vengeance, but with vision. She wasn't handcuffed because of any evidence, warrant, or suspicion grounded in fact. She was handcuffed because of a glance, a single moment of judgment that spoke volumes. That glance, from an officer trained to read the situation, lasted perhaps less than a second, but within that second lived years, no, generations of reinforced narratives. Who looks suspicious, who doesn't belong, who fits the mold of authority, and who deserves the benefit of the doubt. Emily didn't fit the image in that officer's mind. She didn't wear a badge on her chest that day. She wasn't dressed in tactical gear. She was sitting alone in a restaurant. Calm, observant, understated. Her skin was dark. Her presence composed but unreadable to someone who didn't want to read it, and so he assumed that she was part of something shady, someone to be questioned, restrained, neutralized. That assumption did more than put cold steel around her wrists. It nearly detonated 18 months of covert work that she had carried out with absolute precision, discretion, and personal sacrifice. Emily had embedded herself within one of the most elusive drug networks operating across 3 state lines. She had worn a mask every day not to deceive the public, but to protect it. Every step she took in that mission was calculated, timed, and built to avoid exposure. She had to become invisible, not because she was hiding who she was, but because invisibility was the only way to survive in a world that often refuses to see women like her as protectors. All of that was nearly undone in a single, performative act of control. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut under a sky full of cameras. And yet, she didn't rage. She didn't demand sympathy. She didn't go to the media with a dramatic headline, because for Emily, this wasn't about her pride being hurt. It was about something deeper, a question she had asked herself for years. What happens when the people meant to uphold justice become careless with it? Her answer wasn't to burn the system down. It was to hold up a light to it. She gathered the facts, reviewed the body cam footage, requested the internal incident report, built her argument like a prosecutor, not fueled by anger, but by evidence. And then she walked into a department meeting, not to demand apologies, but to demand accountability. She didn't scream, she didn't throw accusations. She calmly laid out what had happened, what it nearly cost, and what needed to change to ensure it wouldn't happen again. Because what happened to Emily was not just an error in judgment, it was a symptom of a larger illness, one that lives quietly in policies not written, in instincts not questioned, in biases buried beneath professionalism. Systems don't collapse because of one bad choice. They collapse when those choices are allowed to repeat, unchallenged. Emily understood this, so instead of fighting the individual, she fought the conditions that allowed his mistake to happen in the first place. She advocated for mandatory bias training, not just as a formality, but as a foundational retraining of perception. She pushed for protocol reviews, for clear lines of verification before an officer engages based on assumption. She helped build cross-department workshops where agents from diverse backgrounds could share their experiences without fear. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted structural memory so that no one else would be forgotten in silence. And she did all of it without ever making herself the center of the reform. There were no press conferences with her face on the front, no viral social media threads. She didn't want to be the symbol. She wanted the system to change, and that required her to stay focused on the work, not the spotlight. Emily knew ego was the quickest way to lose credibility in rooms full of power, so she stayed quiet, but relentless. Every policy she helped shape, every conversation she initiated, every protocol she rewrote, it wasn't for attention, it was for prevention. Her colleagues, even the ones who had stood silently that day, began to shift. Because while some leaders talk about change, Emily embodied it. She didn't shame, she didn't threaten, she educated and she endured. Slowly, the culture around her began to reflect her presence. The whispers stopped, the stares softened, and eventually a few of the same officers who had looked away now sought her advice before making field decisions. Not because they feared her, but because they respected her. In the end, Emily's story is not just one of injustice survived. It's one of injustice transformed. She didn't just move past what happened, she used it. Like a martial artist using an opponent's force to disarm them, she took the impact of that moment and redirected it into momentum, not just for herself, but for others who would come after her. Because to her, justice was never just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about designing a system where that wrong couldn't happen again. Emily Carter's story does more than spotlight one moment of injustice. It exposes the silent architecture that makes such moments possible. The glance that misjudged her was not simply a lapse in personal character, but the result of systemic conditioning. Years of unexamined instincts taught as professional judgment, amplified by a society that too often equates authority with a narrow mold. What makes her story powerful is not the outrage it evokes, but the clarity it demands. That real justice is not measured by how quickly we punish the guilty, but by how courageously we protect the innocent, and even more importantly, by how we correct our vision of each other. The mistake made against Emily is one that happens quietly, daily, in different corners of society. A black woman gets followed in a high-end store. A Muslim man is randomly selected at every airport. A Latinx teenager is asked again where he's really from. None of these are crimes. None of them leave bruises or broken bones, but each one carves a small wound into the fabric of trust, the trust we are supposed to have in the fairness of our institutions, in the presumption of innocence, in the belief that dignity belongs to everyone equally. Emily's handcuffing was dramatic, but the assumptions behind it, they live in boardrooms, in classrooms, in waiting rooms and hiring panels and city council chambers. Her case simply made it visible. That's why her response matters. She didn't fight back with rage. She didn't sink into bitterness. She did something harder. She told the truth, and kept telling it until the truth began to move something. Her strength wasn't just in speaking up, it was in staying, in remaining within the very system that failed her, not because she was naive, but because she was brave enough to believe it could do better. That kind of courage is rare, because change is slow, thankless, It often means working twice as hard to prove what should be obvious. It means watching others get praised for standing on the foundation you quietly built. It means knowing you may not see the full result of the seeds you plant. But Emily planted them anyway, because some people don't wait for justice to arrive. They carry it with them and insist on delivering it themselves. And that leads us to a larger truth. Emily Carter is not a superhero. She's not flawless. She doesn't need to be. Her power lies not in being perfect, but in being principled. She reminds us that change isn't sparked by perfection. It's sparked by persistence, by people who choose to stand up when it's easier to look away, by those who reject the comfort of silence and walk into discomfort with their eyes open. Her story invites us to examine how we see others and how we respond when those views are challenged. Do we double down on old instincts, or do we pause, listen, and adapt? For many, stories like Emily's trigger defensiveness, the reflex to minimize, deflect, or explain away what happened. It was just a mistake. He didn't mean it. Don't turn this into a race thing. But denial doesn't heal. Dismissal doesn't build trust. The truth is, yes, it was a race thing. It was a gender thing. It was an assumption thing. It was a system thing. And until we are willing to say those words without flinching, we won't move forward. Because systemic bias doesn't need monsters to survive. It only needs good people who won't acknowledge it. People who are more afraid of being accused of prejudice than they are of actually perpetuating it. What we need now isn't guilt, it's responsibility. The willingness to listen without defending, to ask hard questions, not of others, but of ourselves. Who gets second chances in our society? Who gets assumed guilty? Who gets to be seen as competent, and who has to prove it over and over again? Emily's story challenges us to stop looking at justice as something that happens in courtrooms and start recognizing it in how we move through everyday spaces. The way we treat people on the subway, the way we read a resume, the way we talk about neighborhoods, the jokes we let slide in the break room. These things are not separate from the system. They are the system, replicated in small moments 1,000 times a day. And yet, there is hope, because stories like Emily's are not just warnings. They're blueprints. They show us what accountability looks like without humiliation, what growth looks like without defensiveness, what leadership looks like when it's not about being right, but about doing right. Emily didn't wait for permission to speak. She didn't wait for someone else to validate her experience. She trusted it. And then she acted, not to shame, but to shape. And slowly, the people around her began to change too, because one story, honestly told, has more power than 1,000 slogans. So let me ask you now, plainly, have you ever been misjudged because of how you looked, how you spoke, or where you came from? Have you ever walked into a room and felt smaller, simply because of what someone assumed about you? Or maybe have you ever caught yourself judging someone too quickly, only to realize later that you were wrong? These moments matter. They are not trivial. They are forks in the road. And every time we choose to reflect rather than react, to learn rather than dismiss, we move 1 inch closer to the world we claim to want. Emily's story is a ripple, but ripples become waves, and waves change shoreline. So, if this story made you pause, don't let the moment pass. Share it. Talk about it. Not just with people who agree with you, but especially with those who might not. Let this story be the beginning of another. Let it be the question that lingers in the next meeting, the next patrol, the next hiring interview. Let it be the shift in how you see and how you're seen. Because change doesn't need everyone. It needs enough people to speak up when it's awkward, enough to challenge the excuse, enough to push past the fear of being too political or too sensitive. Change happens when those who once stayed quiet decide they've been quiet long enough. And if you're someone who's never experienced this kind of judgment firsthand, that's okay. You don't have to feel shame, but you do have a responsibility to listen, to believe, to use your platform, however big or small, to open doors that have been closed to others, because silence protects comfort, but voices protect people, and right now, people need protecting more than ever. So don't scroll past this. Don't shrug it off. Don't call it just another story. Stories shape memory. Memory shapes policy. And policy shapes lives. Emily's story isn't over, because it never was just about her. It's about every person who's been made to feel invisible, unworthy, or dangerous simply for existing. And it's about whether we, as a community, a country, a culture, are finally ready to see them clearly. If you believe that change is possible, help make it visible. Share this story. Talk about it. Carry it forward in the way you lead, vote, teach, parent, and serve. Let it guide not just what you feel, but what you do. And if you're here because you care, subscribe to the channel, not for numbers, but because we need more spaces where truth like this has a voice. Because maybe, just maybe, the next story won't just make you reflect. It'll make you act.